I should have known something was wrong the second I spotted Fred Mulligan, our local HOA president, lurking on my porch at 7 in the morning, clipboard in hand, an overly polished grin plastered across his face. Fred rarely left the comfort of his temperature-controlled Mercedes unless he was on a mission, and it was seldom good news. My coffee mug froze halfway to my lips. The man looked like a lone shark, eyeing overdue collateral. "Morning, Grant," he said, in that clipped tone that could suck the warmth out of sunrise. He flicked his pen like a school principal about to deliver a bad verdict. A cluster of official-looking papers in his grip rattled slightly in the breeze. I try not to roll my eyes. "What can I do for you, Fred?" I asked, feigning politeness while I took a slow sip of coffee. I made a mental note to keep calm. People like Fred feed off drama, especially when they can twist it into an HOA directive. He cleared his throat. "We need your gate key." It was said so plainly, as if demanding a piece of someone's private property was no more complicated than borrowing a cup of sugar. For a moment, I was too stunned to reply. I lived in the Lakeshore Estates community for 20 years, long before Fred and his group of power-hungry sycophants took over the Homeowners Association. When my late wife and I purchased our bungalow, a pleasant, shabby-chic place right along the water's edge, we'd inherited a small side gate that opened directly to the lake. It was grandfathered into our contract, our private walkway to the shore. The official community beach and dock were down the road. My gate was for my personal use, nobody else's. By no definition did it belong to the HOA. "I'm sorry, did you say you need my gate key?" I repeated, making sure my ears weren't playing tricks on me. Fred nodded, as though I were the one being difficult. "We're standardizing lake access. The association wants to update all gates to a single key. It makes everything safer. You see, less confusion for residents, fewer random visitors sneaking onto the property." He licked his lips, or maybe he just rearranged that phony grin. "Our new rule states that all lake entry gates, private or otherwise, fall under the same guidelines." I stared, baffled by the sheer gall. "That's never been a rule before," I replied. "My contract explicitly states that the gate is private property. Nobody but me and my family has ever had access. And there's good reason for that. My wife and I had it installed specifically because we have mobility issues. Her wheelchair needed an easy, direct route. Even though she'd passed on, the gate was part of our home's history." I wasn't about to hand it over. Fred scribbled a note on his clipboard. "We can talk about the specifics at Monday's board meeting," he said. "All I'm asking is that you comply by handing over your key. We'll give you the standardized version in return. It's a fair trade, Grant. Everyone in the association is subject to the same set of rules." That rankled me. I wanted to laugh in his face. Here he was, calmly demanding that I sacrifice a piece of my own property, for which I paid taxes and maintain out of my own pocket, so he could label it a communal access point. In essence, the HOA wanted to waltz all over my yard whenever they felt like it. They wanted to convert my private gate into a public thoroughfare, making my property a direct path from the street to the lake. Convenient for them, but a blatant overreach. I pinned him with a steady gaze. "It's not a fair trade, nor is it legal. I'm not giving you my key." Fred's eyes hardened, and for a fleeting moment, that politician's smile cracked at the edges. He tucked the clipboard under his arm. "I'd hate to see this result in fines or a lien against your property." The threat landed like a hammer on an anvil. I'd known for a while the HOA was edging more controlling, but this was the first time they'd pointed their laser at me. I kept my tone firm. "I suggest you take that up with my lawyer before you go making threats." He inhaled sharply, then smoothed his comb-over hair. "I'll see you at the board meeting, Grant. Think it over." Without another word, Fred trudged back to his car. The gravel crunched beneath his expensive loafers, the tension heavier than the August heat. I didn't realize my hands were shaking until my coffee sloshed over the rim of the mug. Anger, a tangible heat in my chest, made it hard to form coherent thoughts. Who did Fred think he was? Even with the HOA's growing authority in Lakeshore Estates, they had no business messing with a structure that existed before the association's newest bylaws. I gazed out at the sun shimmering over the lake, my frustration tinged with sorrow as I remembered how my wife used to wheel herself down the gentle slope, fishing rod balanced on her lap. That gate was part of our life here, our memories, our privacy. I took a deep breath to steady myself. Over the years, I'd heard gossip about the HOA imposing ridiculous rules: the color of your shutters, how tall your shrubs could be, which mailboxes were community approved. But forcibly seizing property was next level. Something told me this wasn't going to be settled quickly, and I sure wasn't going to fold just because they threatened me with fines. Walking back inside, I fished through the folder where I kept my home documents. I found the original contract, complete with diagrams and descriptions of the private walkway. This gate wasn't just a perk. It was legally part of my property's boundary rights. If the HOA wanted to challenge that, they'd have a fight on their hands. I figured they'd try to strong-arm me, maybe tack on fees, or even drag me in front of some rigged compliance committee. But they discovered soon enough that I wasn't about to be bullied. And if they pressed further, well, I wasn't shy about calling the cops. Just because they acted like an iron-fisted government didn't mean they actually were. For the rest of the day, my stomach churned with a mix of frustration and anxious anticipation. I knew that Fred and his cronies would test my resolve. They thrived on intimidation and assumed everyone would cave rather than risk confrontation or extra expenses. But I wasn't everyone. I told myself, this time, they've messed with the wrong homeowner. Little did I know, the fight was only beginning, and it was about to get a lot uglier than I'd anticipated. The following Sunday evening, I found myself in the cramped, wood-paneled meeting room at the Lakeshore Estates Clubhouse. The outdated fluorescent lights flickered overhead, lending a sickly glow to the cluster of residents seated in cheap plastic chairs. A battered podium stood at the front, with a microphone that crackled whenever someone tapped it. The HOA board was arranged in a neat row, each member sporting a stiff posture and vaguely forced smile. Fred, of course, sat center stage, glancing down at everyone like he was presiding over a high court. Next to him was Daisy Hargrove, the secretary, known for taking minutes with near-fanatical precision. Then there was Wilma Clayton, treasurer, who sometimes reminded me of the stoic librarians from my childhood, strict, unflappable, and unyielding about late fees. The room was about half full. Folks older than me who'd been in the neighborhood longer than Fred, and a smattering of newer residents who looked nervous to be out in public without an official blessing from a board. Some people mumbled greetings as I passed, though I caught glimpses of pity in their eyes. They must have already heard the rumor. Grant's in trouble with the board. I took a seat near the back, crossing my arms. My neighbor, Mary Hodges, sidled up next to me. "I heard they're going after your lake gate," she whispered, her voice thick with worry. Mary had a heart of gold and a husky laugh, but her face was pinched with concern. "Yep," I muttered, "they want my key. I'm not budging." She shook her head. "This board's gone nuts lately. The other day, they threatened to fine me because my garden fence was 3 inches taller than the uniform standard. It's the same fence I've had for a decade, but apparently, they changed the standard last month." She fiddled with the zipper on her purse. I tried to argue, but they said I'd have to submit a formal request to remain non-compliant. Complete madness. I gave her a sympathetic smile. "Hang in there, Mary. Maybe if enough of us push back, they'll think twice." Before I could say more, Fred cleared his throat and tapped the microphone. "Good evening, everyone. We'll try to keep tonight's meeting moving along. First on the agenda, lawn maintenance fees." He droned on about new rules, updated fines, and something about mandatory fertilizer brand preferences. The chatter in the room vacillated between boredom and annoyance. Occasionally, Daisy scribbled so violently I worried she'd rip through the pages of her notepad. Half an hour in, I was about ready to stand up and walk out. They seemed determined to talk in circles about everything except the big issue. It wasn't until Fred's voice shifted to a more formal, clipped cadence that I realized we'd arrived at the main event. Next agenda item: standardization of lake access gates. He smirked. "As some of you know, we're implementing a uniform key system to ensure safety and consistency. This measure helps us track who enters the lakefront to prevent liability issues and deter trespassers." Liability issues? Trespassers? I nearly scoffed. In 20 years, I'd never seen any random folks near my gate. Frankly, the only suspicious activity we had was raccoons rummaging through trash cans. Fred continued, "We've identified a handful of private gates that have yet to be updated with the new keys. Those property owners are hereby requested to relinquish their personal keys and accept the new, standardized ones." He picked up a short list, made a show of reading names, and paused. "Most of you have already complied." His gaze slid to me, eyes narrowing. "Except for Mr. Grant Foster." All heads turned in my direction. I rose slowly, ignoring the spike of anxiety in my chest. "That's correct," I said, voice carrying surprisingly well without the microphone. "And I have no intention of giving you my key. My deed clearly states this gate is a private structure. It existed before these so-called rules were put in place. You can't just demand property that isn't yours." Fred's face never wavered from that rehearsed expression of measured authority. "Mr. Foster, the HOA's bylaws evolved to protect the community. There's a process in place for. Your bylaws don't supersede my legal property rights." I interjected, my annoyance breaking through. "This isn't about safety. It's about turning my yard into a public walkway. You want a shortcut to the lake, and you're not entitled to it." Murmurs spread through the audience. Mary placed a reassuring hand on my arm. I scanned the crowd, noticing how some folks seemed to fidget guiltily, likely having surrendered their gates without a fight. The tension in the room was palpable. Wilma, the treasurer, cleared her throat. "The board is concerned about liability. If a non-resident slips and falls on your private walkway, who's accountable? We're only trying to protect the association as a whole." "That's a weak excuse," I snapped. "You're more likely to expose yourselves to liability by letting everyone march through my yard. Right now, if anyone's on my property without permission, it's trespassing, period." Fred lifted a hand to cut me off. "Mr. Foster, we are offering you a courtesy period of 14 days to comply or face penalties under the revised community guidelines. The motion to impose fines will be introduced shortly if you continue this stance." I took a step forward, heart pounding. "Do whatever you want. My gate key stays with me. If you try to put a lien on my house, I'll see you in court." Daisy scribbled furiously, capturing every syllable. A flicker of frustration flickered across Fred's face. He shifted tactics, turning to the crowd. "Is there anyone else who objects to the new key policy? Now's the time to speak up." The silence was crushing. A handful of neighbors exchanged uneasy glances. Nobody dared raise a hand. They'd seen how quickly the board turned combative. Some probably sympathized with me, but didn't want to be singled out. Others had already caved and didn't see the point in further conflict. Fred's smirk returned. "There you have it. Mr. Foster stands alone in his opposition. Let me noted that he refuses to comply, placing the community at potential risk. The board will convene to determine next steps." The meeting moved on, though the mood remained tense and awkward. I stayed until the end, just to show I wasn't afraid of them. But by the time I left, my nerves were frayed. I wondered how far the HOA was willing to push. Would they really start slapping me with daily fines? Attempt to block my property from the official amenities? Even threaten foreclosure? In my more paranoid moments, I wondered if they'd stoop to sabotage, like forcibly breaking my lock under the cover of darkness. As I climbed into my truck, Mary caught up to me again. "I'm so sorry, Grant. Let me know if you need help." "I believe you're in the right," she said softly. "Thanks," I said, giving her a grateful nod. "I'll keep you posted." I pulled out of the parking lot, headlights illuminating the lonely road ahead. The air was thick with summer heat and tension. Fred's smug expression seared into my mind. 14 days to comply. I clenched the steering wheel. Over my dead body would they take my gate key without a serious fight? A mere 3 days after that fraught board meeting, I came home to find a letter taped to my front door. Not in my mailbox, taped right on the door as if the sender wanted to rub my nose in it. The HOA letterhead was official, imposing, and downright irritating. I tore it off and scanned the contents. A formal notice of noncompliance, a schedule of escalating fines if I refused to hand over the key, and a thinly veiled warning about further legal measures. The arrogance was staggering. My jaw tightened as I read the last line. We encourage you to comply for the benefit of the entire Lakeshore Estates community. It was signed in swirling black ink by Fred Mulligan himself. I marched inside, tossing the letter onto my kitchen table. I'd half expected some official action, but seeing it in print lit a fresh fire under my skin. I grabbed my phone and called my attorney, Laura Diaz, a no-nonsense woman who'd helped me navigate probate when my wife passed. She was the kind of lawyer who knew the difference between rightful authority and pure intimidation. "Grant, I'm sorry you have to deal with this," Laura said after I explained the situation. She let out a slow whistle. "They're being uncommonly brazen." "You're telling me," I replied, pacing circles around my living room. "I can't believe they think they can just snatch my property." Laura's voice was calm, but serious. "They're counting on you being intimidated. Homeowners associations rely on fear of fines and liens to get compliance. But remember, HOA bylaws don't override a legal deed. If the gate is explicitly stated as private property in your contract, that's tough to challenge. We can fight this." A wave of relief settled over me. "I appreciate it. I'll send over copies of my deed and their letter. Let me know what I should do next." She paused. "In the meantime, be careful. Some HOAs play dirty. Don't be surprised if they escalate quickly, locking you out of certain community amenities or even trying to break into your gate. If they harass you, call the police." After hanging up, I realized how right she might be. The next few days, I doubled down on vigilance. I installed a small security camera near my side gate, an older model but functional enough to capture anyone meddling. I also kept my phone handy whenever I stepped outside, just in case. Sure enough, trouble came knocking sooner than I expected. One sweltering afternoon, as I was weeding my front yard, a pair of young men wearing bright orange, HOA compliance vests strolled up my driveway like they owned the place. They carried a curious assortment of tools, a crowbar among them. My heart jolted. I wiped sweat from my brow and approached them. "Can I help you?" One of them, a tall, lanky kid who couldn't have been more than 19, looked away awkwardly. The older one, maybe mid-20s, cleared his throat. "We're here on behalf of Lakeshore Estates, HOA, he said, reciting from some internal script. "We need to inspect your side gate for safety compliance and possible rekeying." I glared at the crowbar. "You intend to use that to inspect my property?" My voice was sharper than I intended, but I was rattled at the nerve. They exchanged glances. The older one tried a diplomatic tone. "Sir, we were informed that all gates must switch to the association's lock by the end of the week. We have a standard lock and keys here. We're just doing our job." "Your job includes trespassing?" I retorted, stepping in their path. "Listen carefully. That gate is private property. You have no right to tamper with it. If you do, I'll call the police." The younger man took a step back, clearly uncomfortable with the confrontation. The older one hesitated, as though weighing how far he was willing to push. Finally, he said, "We have orders from Mr. Mulligan, but if you insist on blocking us, we'll have to file a report with the board." "Go ahead and file your report. Now get off my property," I said, pointing toward the road. They left without further protest, though I heard one of them mutter something about me being a real piece of work. The second they were gone, I snapped a few photos of their van's license plate and made sure my security camera had captured the encounter. Then, with a shaky breath, I called Laura again. She told me to sit tight and document everything. In the days that followed, I received 2 more identical letters from the HOA, plus a new one labeled Final Warning. The fines were stacking up: $100 for day 1 of non-compliance, $200 for day 2, and so on. It was borderline extortion, but I refused to pay a cent. Laura reassured me that paying would only validate their demands, and we were preparing a legal response. I tried to go about my usual routines: grocery shopping, reading on my back porch, and occasionally fishing at the official community dock, just to show I wasn't avoiding any shared spaces. But a lingering anxiety kept me on edge. Everywhere I turned, I felt the stares of neighbors who either pitied me or silently judged me for standing up to the board. A few, like Mary, showed quiet support, but the majority were just watching from the sidelines. Then came the biggest affront of all. One evening, I heard a persistent, rattling noise from the direction of my side gate. It was nearly dusk, the sky awash in pale pink and lavender. My pulse spiked. I grabbed my phone and hurried over, switching on the gate's motion sensor light. I found none other than Fred Mulligan himself, crouched by the latch with some sort of tool in hand. His shiny black sedan was parked near the curb, engine still running. The nerve of him sneaking around in the twilight like a cat burglar. My outrage flared. "Fred," I barked, stepping forward. "What the devil do you think you're doing?" He whirled, then straightened, smoothing his shirt. His face took on that plastic smile again. "Grant, fancy seeing you." I jabbed a finger toward the gate. "Breaking and entering is what you were doing." My voice echoed down the darkening street. He gave a feigned laugh. Now, let's not be dramatic. I was checking the integrity of the latch. We can't have a defective lock that poses a safety risk." My temper boiled. "Get off my property, or I'm calling the police immediately." He lifted his hands in mock surrender. "All right, but I'll be reporting your refusal to comply again. This could have been quick and painless if you just handed over the key." I unlocked my phone, finger hovering over the call button. "I'm dead serious, Fred. Don't make me repeat myself." He stepped around me, walking briskly to his car. His face had lost its forced amusement. There was a shadow of genuine anger in his eyes. Without another word, he got in his sedan and sped off. I stood there, heart pounding, the dusk breeze prickling my skin. I wondered how much further Fred would go to assert the HOA's control. If he was willing to skulk around with a tool set, what else was he capable of? My mind returned to Laura's advice. If they harass you, call the police. I'd given Fred a pass this time, but I vowed that if he tried something like this again, I wouldn't hesitate. And as I turned to close up the gate, a new dread settled in my gut. This was war, and Fred was playing to win. But so was I. A week later, just shy of the HOA's arbitrary deadline, the showdown arrived. I'd spent the morning emailing with Laura, finalizing our cease and desist letter to the board. She assured me that once we filed it, and threatened a lawsuit, they'd either back off or risk an expensive legal battle. But apparently, Fred decided he wasn't going to wait for the courts. Around noon, I noticed a flurry of motion outside my living room window. A large white truck idled at the curb, emblazoned with the logo of some local locksmith and security company. Standing beside it were Fred, Wilma, and Daisy, like a triumvirate of self-righteous officials itching to prove a point. I set down my sandwich and strode out onto the porch. Fred gave me a curt nod. "Grant, we're here to replace your lock as required by the association's bylaw. We've tried to handle this amicably, but your refusal has forced our hand." I felt a surge of adrenaline. "You have no right. This is private property." I scanned the truck, a couple of locksmith technicians milling about, looking as though they'd rather be anywhere else. Daisy stepped forward, brandishing a folder of documents. "We have the official order signed by the board. Additionally, we've recorded your noncompliance. We must ensure the community's safety." She said it like she was reading from a script. I stared them down. "You know, this is unlawful. You can't just break onto my property. According to the new HOA regulations, we can," Wilma interjected, her face stern. "Your gate abuts the community lakefront. You're out of compliance, and that affects everyone. It's standard practice to rectify the situation directly." "Standard practice? That's a joke," I hissed, pulling out my phone. "If any of you so much as touches that gate, I'm calling the police. And I'll show them my deed, which clearly identifies that gate as part of my private property." Fred crossed his arms, a flicker of hesitation in his eyes. Daisy and Wilma exchanged uncertain looks. They weren't used to being challenged so openly, especially in front of hired contractors. Still, they stood their ground. "All right," Fred said, his tone icy. "Call the police if you must, but we're within our rights to enforce the rules. I'd rather handle this like adults." I gave him a humorless laugh. "Funny, Fred. Adults don't sneak around in the dark with crowbars." Then, without another word, I dialed 911. My hands trembled slightly, but my resolve was firm. As the phone rang, Fred smirked, apparently convinced the cops wouldn't side with me. A few neighbors had started to gather at a distance, drawn by the commotion. When the dispatcher answered, I calmly explained the situation. I have members of my homeowners association attempting to break onto my private property to install a lock against my will. I'm requesting an officer to intervene. The dispatcher confirmed someone would be on the way. A tense silence settled over the cul-de-sac. The locksmith technicians looked deeply uncomfortable, turning to Fred with questioning glances. One ventured, "Should we wait, Mr. Mulligan?" Or, Fred's jaw clenched. "Yes, we'll wait. Let's get this sorted out properly." But he kept glaring at me, as if I were the villain for defending my own property. We waited nearly 20 minutes in hot, humid stillness. I refused to budge from my porch, arms folded across my chest. The board members muttered among themselves. Meanwhile, a small crowd of curious onlookers formed along the sidewalk, Mary among them, looking anxious yet quietly supportive. Eventually, a police cruiser pulled up. Out stepped Officer Martinez, a stout man with a patient expression. He surveyed the scene. The truck, the board members, me standing on my porch. Right away, he seemed to realize this wasn't a routine call. I approached him with a respectful nod. "Thank you for coming, officer. I'm Grant Foster. This is my home. These people," I gestured to Fred and company, "are trying to replace the lock on my private gate without my permission." Fred stepped forward, wearing his best concerned community leader face. "Officer, I'm Fred Mulligan, president of the Lakeshore Estates HOA. We have full authority under our bylaws to standardize access to the lake. Mr. Foster has refused to comply with mandatory guidelines." Officer Martinez raised an eyebrow. "You do realize a homeowners association can't override property law, correct?" Fred opened his mouth, but Wilma cut in. "This gate is adjacent to the lake, which is communal property." I interrupted, handing Officer Martinez a copy of my deed and property map. "Here, you can see this gate is explicitly included within my property boundary. The HOA is demanding my key under new rules that have never been tested in court." Officer Martinez studied the documents, flipping through the pages carefully. Then he turned to Fred. "Sir, do you have any documentation that shows you have the legal right to forcibly enter this gate and replace the lock?" Fred's composure cracked slightly. "Well, we have the board's bylaws, which are not the same as a court order," Martinez stated firmly. "Bylaws can't grant you authority to break on a private property. If you want to challenge Mr. Foster's deed, you need to go through the proper legal channels." Daisy tried to intervene. "We have an order from our compliance committee." The officer held up a hand. "I need a judge's order, not a committee's. Unless Mr. Foster grants you permission, you can't change his lock. If you attempt to do so, it's considered trespassing and possible vandalism. That's a criminal offense." A hush fell over the gathered crowd. Mary let out a barely suppressed sigh of relief. Wilma's face turned an alarming shade of red. Fred, evidently rattled, sputtered, "We're just acting in the best interest of the community." Officer Martinez gave a small shrug. "I'm not here to interpret your association's best interests. I'm here to enforce the law. And the law says Mr. Foster's gate is off limits to you without his consent or a court injunction. Do you understand?" Stony silence from the board members. Finally, Fred lifted his hands. "Fine. We'll take it up with our legal counsel." His voice dripped with frustration. Then he spun to the locksmith technicians. "Pack it up. We're leaving." They needed no encouragement. Within minutes, the board members and their hired crew piled into their vehicles, pulling away under the watchful gaze of the neighbors. I exhaled, the tension in my shoulders slowly unknotting. Officer Martinez handed back my documents. "If they try anything else, call us right away. You've got everything in order on your side." I thanked him, feeling a surge of gratitude for his straightforward handling of the situation. After he drove off, neighbors began drifting away, some with small smiles or approving nods in my direction. Mary hurried over and gave my arm a squeeze. "I can't believe you did it," she said, eyes shining with admiration. "You stood up to them and won." I managed a tired smile. They'll be back with more threats or legal nonsense. But at least they know they can't steamroll me. I glanced at the gate, feeling a wave of triumph and relief. I'm just glad the police backed me up. The law's on my side. Over the next week, sure enough, I received a few more letters threatening further action. But with Laura's help, I sent them a cease and desist and reminded them I was more than willing to countersue for harassment if they continued. Word soon spread around Lakeshore Estates of what had transpired, and I was pleasantly surprised to find that more neighbors began quietly voicing their complaints about the HOA's overreach. A few even banded together, requesting a recall election for Fred and the current board. There was talk of reforming the bylaws, ensuring checks and balances so one group couldn't weaponize the rules for power grabs. Eventually, the fines they'd levied against me were dropped. The HOA's own lawyers likely realized it was a battle they couldn't win without incurring massive costs. One evening, I was relaxing in a lawn chair by my private walkway, a gentle breeze rippling across the lake surface. The sun was setting, painting the sky in strokes of orange and purple. I found myself recalling all the times my wife and I came down this path, her wheelchair bumping lightly along the pavers as we shared quiet sunsets together. Now, this gate had become a symbol of something greater, standing up for what you rightly own, refusing to bend to bullying tactics. I still live in Lakeshore Estates, yes, but I no longer felt I had to tiptoe around the whims of the board. Not after the day the HOA tried to seize my gate keys for their easier lake entry and found themselves face-to-face with the police. If they thought I was the kind of person who'd cave under threat of fines, they were sorely mistaken. They learned that lesson the hard way, and I hoped it would remind them, and everyone else, that a signature on an HOA rulebook doesn't grant free rein to trample on basic property rights. With a final contented sigh, I locked my gate, stepped back onto my porch, and let the summer dusk settle over me. The tension was behind me, replaced by the comforting knowledge that sometimes the little guy does win. And in this case, I had the law and a good lawyer on my side, ensuring that the place I called home remained indisputably mine. The end.